Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Wurf Memorial Lecture. I'm Sharon Block. Oh, yeah. I'm Sharon Block. I know most of you, all of you. Anyway, anybody I don't know. I'm Sharon Block. I'm a professor here at Harvard Law School and the executive director of the, I was going to say labor and work life program. Oh my God, it has been a long day. Center for Labor and a Just Economy. And we really are thrilled to have you all here with us for a very exciting evening. So the Wurf Lecture is named in memory of a very special person in a special person in the world, a special person in the labor movement, a special person to us here as part of the Harvard Trade Union program. So I want to make sure that everybody knows and we keep his memory and his life as part of this event. So I am going to turn this over to another very special guest in just a second, but first I'm going to introduce her to all of you. So Elisa McBride is the Secretary-Treasurer of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO. She was just reelected to her position last year. Yay. In her AFSCME role, Elisa is a member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council and serves on the Civil and Human Rights, Immigration, and Women Workers Committees. Very appropriate for tonight. But I mean, she's special to us because she's also like our point person in this great partnership that we have had over the years between the Harvard Trade Union program, the center, and AFSCME. And we're so proud of the work that we do together over all these years, whether it's bringing great young people together in the Union Scholars Program, or our great AFSCME members who participate in the HTUP every year, or programs we do at the Kennedy School, or research that we do in the public sector. And I'm looking at Will, who you'll hear from tomorrow in the HTUP, was another sort of vector of this great partnership. But I do want to say in this moment, this week in particular, what comes up for me the most in thinking about the deep relationship between AFSCME and our program is just deep pride. And I am proud to stand with a union that is doing so much to stand up for public sector workers, including federal employees, or especially federal employees who AFSCME doesn't even represent, and the thousands and thousands of non-union federal workers. AFSCME has been at the forefront of much of the litigation that has been filed over the past, I know it's only been like 3 weeks, some of which has already been successful, at least in the short term, in protecting federal workers. You know, I spent most of my career in the federal government, and so, you know, my heart is just going out to these workers, and I'm just, again, so proud to stand with AFSCME and everything that you guys are doing to protect our federal workforce and the incredibly important work that government workers do all over the country. So, turn it over to Elisa.
Oh, it's so good to be here with movers and shakers and organizers and leaders in a year like this, and a week like this, and on a day like this, because every day is a new outrage right now. And I am here on behalf of AFSCME, our 1.4 million members in the public service and in healthcare. We maintain civilization as you know it, as one of our members says, and we do represent federal workers, not as many as some other unions. But guess what? This week, our locals in the federal government have grown hugely because people are joining and mobilizing like never before, which is a great sign for our movement. So I am here to do one brief thing, which is to lift up the memory of Jerry Wurf, who this lecture was named for, and who our program at Harvard was named for. He was the president of our union starting in the 1960s through 1981. He was a ferocious advocate, not just for civil service, something that we really need to reclaim and re-embrace right now, but also for collective bargaining rights and a voice on the job for sanitation workers and social workers and healthcare workers and all sorts of employees in the public service. And he was president of our union in 1968 when a group of sanitation workers went on strike in Memphis, Tennessee, and fought for the right to have a union, let alone have a union contract. And he was the person who partnered with our just recently passed away former Secretary-Treasurer, William Lucy, who went in and supported those workers and helped them organize for the first time. And Bill Lucy gave this lecture in 2018 and told that story, and we do have that publication for anyone who wants to know more about it. So I want to lift up Jerry Wurf, I want to lift up Bill Lucy, and finally I want to lift up Mildred Wurf, who was Bill's wife, or Jerry's wife, sorry. Mildred was Jerry Wurf's wife. And she created the fund and the partnership with Harvard. And she was a really incredible advocate for workers' rights herself, but also for the role that women leaders play in the labor movement. She would always get us to see the importance of having women in these chairs, workers represented at Harvard, and she would be so thrilled not only that we have a female lecturer, which we've had many of, but one who's going to talk about women in the workforce and equity for women workers. So we carry on in their memory with incredible scholarships and research, including some great new research about the impact of heat standards for workers who work outdoors, something that's going to matter more and more to workers in this country and in the globe. So I'm here to greet you. I'm here to say thanks to Sharon and the Harvard staff for making this happen. And I'm eagerly awaiting the chance to hear the lecture and to talk with all of you afterwards. And I think I'm turning it back to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. So Claudia Goldin is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University and holds the Lee and Espelita Professorship of Arts and Sciences also here at Harvard. An economic historian and a labor economist, Professor Goldin's research covers a wide range of topics, including the female labor force, the gender gap in earnings, income inequality, technological change, education, immigration. Can you imagine anybody whose life's work is more timely than Professor Goldin's is to this moment? Most of her research interprets the present through the lens of the past and explores the origins of current issues of concern. Her most recent book, and I saw copies of it floating around here, is Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity, which has been translated into 15 languages. I count myself and so many of my colleagues, especially when I was in the government, as among those who have long been fascinated by Professor Goldin's work and have relied on it to inform policy choices that we hoped were designed to build greater equity in the workforce. So, as I know many of you probably were, I was thrilled when I heard the news on October 9th, 2023, that Professor Goldin had been awarded the Sverre Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, what most of us would call the Nobel Prize in Economics, for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. And I have to say, that's only like the second coolest thing that she's ever done. The first coolest thing that Professor Goldin has ever done is to throw out the first pitch at a Red Sox game. So to throw a strike, even cooler. But Professor Goldin is best known for her historical work on women in the U.S. economy, and that's why we're so excited to have her deliver the Wurf Lecture this year. As many of you probably know, more than half of all public sector workers are women. They are our teachers and our healthcare workers, and they are also the essential workers who just make our government function. It has a different resonance this week. So if you want to understand the health and the vibrancy of the public sector labor movement, which is also key to understanding the health and the vibrancy of the labor movement overall as private sector union density continues to decrease, you must understand the health and vibrancy of women's participation in the labor market. But the importance of the issues that Professor Goldin has illuminated in her work has ripple effects even in this particular lens. These women who predominate in public sector jobs and who have thrived for decades with the support of their public sector unions are often the bedrock of support for their families and their communities. Their public sector union jobs have been their means of entry into the middle class, and they've brought their families along. And so understanding women in the economy is key to understanding public sector labor movement, the labor movement overall, and to understanding the state of our communities. And so with that, I am thrilled to turn it over to the Nobel laureate, Claudia Goldin.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here with all of you leaders. And I was given all of your bios, so I know everything about every single one of you, okay? So, women are now at the center of many of the world's economies. And it's not just because they're engaged in paid employment more than ever before. And most nations in this map in dark blue have female employment to population ratios that exceed 3/4, although some are relatively low. Women are also at the center of the world's economies because today they are the majority of college students in every single OECD nation. And they are also at the center because of the hidden care work they do all the world over, and also because, let's face it, they largely determine the birth rate. But women were not always at the center, and they didn't always control their fates, and they don't today in many parts of the world. Women shifted their focus of market-oriented work across time and in somewhat nonlinear ways. When the goods-producing market and the home were nearly the same, when businesses were part of the home, when we had family farms, women were often employed for pay or profit, even when they had young children. But as work moved out of the home, out of the family firm and farm, and to the wider market of larger enterprises, women's measured economic activity, and that's the way we measure it, not exactly what they did, it decreased. They remained at home while the men went off to larger firms and to the market to work. But women eventually increased their role in the market economy and in paid work. And this happened as their earnings rose relative to the cost of household-produced goods of all types. Therefore, the market role of women has tended to be U-shaped, as you see here, across the long history of a nation and also across countries in cross-section, we'll see. This finding has been analyzed by numerous researchers, both in cross-section and looking at country fixed effects, that's within country. It's even clear in the most recent data that we have, this is just from 2022, on the employment to population ratio for 25 to 54-year-old women, and that's what's being given on the vertical axis, relative to GDP per capita, and that's on the horizontal axis, and there are 165 nations in this picture. The subsequent move of women from the home to the market, the upward portion of this U, is often stymied by social stigma and traditions regarding the paid employment of women. And that is still the case in many parts of the world. And the star here is India, at relatively low female labor force participation relative to its per capita income. Since industrial work has historically been more onerous than office work, social stigma often develops around the employment of married women in those activities, possibly to incentivize men. The man who allows his wife to work in a dangerous pursuit is chastened as slothful and indolent. The stigma serves to increase the economists' term, what we term the income effect. That's the negative impact of income on employment, and to reduce what we call the substitution effect, which is the positive impact of relative wages on employment. And it does this since with stigma, women's employment is less sensitive to their own wage, but more sensitive to the family's income, mainly that of the husband. Stigma was reduced as women's jobs became less onerous and were done by more educated women. The subsequent move of women from the home to the market, this upward portion of the U, is often, as I said, stymied. So education levels greatly rose in the early 20th century, and employment expanded in office and professional jobs, rising from just 20% of all employed women in 1900 to 40% by 1920. Both of these factors led young women to enter the labor force and remain employed for a short time, even after they got married. Thus, the rising portion of the U, which we see here for two groups by race, began to unfurl. The woman who was employed at 20 and then exited to have children was more likely to re-enter when her children were a bit older, and especially if labor demand greatly increased, as it did in the US in the 1940s and the 1950s. The upward portion of the U was thereby set in motion. Real wages increased relative to the opportunity cost of household production, and female labor force participation rates in turn greatly increased. Because there was less stigma to the work that they did, income effects were lower, substitution effects were greater. But then, after many decades of increased participation and what I would call evolutionary change, something momentous occurred. No longer did young women want to be employed only to provide for themselves and their families. Young women could see that their mothers, that their aunts, that the older women that they knew had been employed for substantial periods, but without much career progression. They had entered the labor force without a long-run plan. The younger generation vowed to have one. In the late 60s and 70s, the group experienced what I term a quiet revolution, distinct from the noisier revolution that we see before us. And it was a movement that led to greatly expanded legal rights of women in employment, in education, in family, in credit, and in judicial matters. The inklings of this quiet revolution can first be seen when these women were girls. They took more math, they took more science courses, and they did this to prepare for college, and to college they went. They had rising expectations of their future employment, and they responded by increasing their college-going rates. They did that also by switching their majors to more lucrative and career-oriented fields. By 1982, that long ago, more women than men were graduating college in the US, despite the fact that we seem to have recognized this only in the 2000s. It was a long time ago. And today, women are 58% of those obtaining a BA degree in the US. And as more young women than men have attended college, they've done this in every OECD country, as you can see. On the horizontal axis is the percent of men with some college, and on the vertical axis is the percent of women for all the countries in the OECD and more. And you can see that there's not a single dot below the 45-degree line. Now, the prime drivers in the story that I've just told was set in motion in the early 20th century, and they were carried through history by cohorts of women. Social and economic changes are often slow to progress because they require a succession of generations. One reason for the low birth rate in Southern Europe and parts of Asia, for example, is that rapid economic and educational change often results in generational and gendered conflicts. Countries in which women do more unpaid household work than do men have lower total fertility rates. And in this diagram, the horizontal axis is the difference in the amount of time, as you can see, that women work in unpaid household work relative to men. And the vertical axis is the total fertility rate. There is a clear relationship between the more work that women do in the home relative to men and the lower fertility rate. So most of the long-term changes that I have mentioned were sparked by major technological innovations, those that shifted production from agriculture to industry, those that increased the economic return to education, those that altered household production, those that expanded markets in general. These include big changes like electricity and like the growth of large-scale firms. But there was another critical innovation that was really tiny. It was as tiny as a pill. And in fact, it was the pill. It was the birth control pill, a female-controlled, reliable form of birth control. But to be fully effective in driving social change, it needed a shift in institutions. And during the first decade or more after it was invented, its dissemination was governed by state laws, in particular this state, which was the second to the last to change its laws. And in other countries as well, by their laws. And these were laws that regulated its use by young and unmarried women. But by the late 60s and early 70s, young women, even single women, even those on college campuses, had gained access to this thing, the pill. In 1970, the median age at first marriage for recent college graduate women born in the late 1940s was younger than 23. That's the median. It means half of these college graduate women married before age 23. When I mention that to my students, they gasp. I didn't hear them gasp. Because of the pill, and that's a causal relationship, the age at first marriage began to soar. And 6 years later, it was 25. The additional breathing space before marriage and childbirth gave college graduate women time to enter law school, business school, medical school, and then I always add, and maybe even start a PhD. And professional school enrollment of women, as you can see here, the vertical axis is the fraction in each of these professional school entering or graduating years, that's female. You can see the professional school graduation enrollment of women climbed rapidly after 1970. And professional school enrollment of women, therefore, actually continued to increase and is now, in many of these areas, about 50%. College graduate women shifted from being teachers, nurses, administrators, and librarians. Of course, not all shifted. Some shifted to being doctors, lawyers, professors, and managers. The shift was from planning for family and then a good job to desiring a career and a family. And the increased female labor force was this increase was an evolutionary change, but this change in the expectations of women, in their horizon, in their sense of identity, in their newfound ability to control their destinies was not evolutionary, it was revolutionary. I've thus far explained how the female labor force expanded and how the upward portion of that U unfurled, but I haven't said anything yet about the intensive margin of hours, and I haven't said anything about women's earnings relative to men's. As employment levels for women rose from the 1950s to around 1980, women's earnings relative to men's did not change very much on average. And that was due in part to the fact that their participation rates increased. Women who were pulled into the labor force had job experiences that were somewhat distant, often brief. And that put a downward pressure on their earnings relative to the average working woman, relative to that of the man. But around 1980, differences began to narrow considerably as increased women's participation rates actually produced real gains in their job experience. In addition, women's, as we saw before, college enrollment rate had greatly expanded. Their courses had changed. The increase of women's earnings relative to men's in the 1980s and 1990s in the US was truly spectacular. The banner of 59 cents on the dollar turned into a banner of 65 cents on the dollar, and then to 75 cents, and now to around 83 cents. But even though the banners were rewritten many times over, the metric that was used was never up to the task. So let's see why. The question that often gets raised is what accounts for the remaining gap now that so many of the determinants of earnings are the same for men and women. That is, to the extent that earnings in a competitive labor market are determined by pre-labor market characteristics such as education and training, as well as those that are pre-job, such as experience in previous positions. And if these characteristics have become almost identical, the question is, what remains? Many clues exist that are going to reveal the answer. The first clue is that the gender gap in earnings for college graduates became larger than the aggregate around 1990, when the earnings distribution for college graduates began to widen the most. Yet another critically important clue is that female hours and earnings plummet with the birth of a child, even in places like the Nordic countries, like Sweden, which we think is so special. Still more clues concern which occupations have large and which have small differences in earnings between men and women, given a set of standard observables. It's important to realize that the majority of earnings differences by occupation or within these groups of occupations rather than across, and this is given around 500 occupations. So what I want to do now is explore the within occupation differences. I have categorized occupations by sector. Very few sectors: health, business, tech, science, and other. And I'm doing this mainly for college-educated individuals in medium to high wage occupations. I have estimated what I call residual sex ratios of annual earnings. And on the vertical axis, I give that and I graph that against male annual income. So on the horizontal axis is male income. On the vertical axis is what we think of as the gender gap, and that goes from around 1 at the top, a little bit above 1, to the bottom here is about 0.6. Okay. And the numbers next to those numbers are in logs. So I translated it because very few people can can exponentiate in their head. So I did it for you. So what I did was I found that gender gaps in earnings were generally higher in certain fields. So you see here, there are a lot of dots. There are red dots and blue dots and yellow and green. But now let's just look at the red ones mainly. So I found that gender gaps in earnings were generally higher in finance, banking, management, and other corporate and business occupations. Those are the red squares. And they're generally lower in tech and science occupations, which are the triangles. And that's except for one deviant dot at the bottom, and that happens to be a deviant occupation. It's an airline pilot, okay? Pilots are very different from people in these other occupations, we'll see. The many health fields, which are the blue diamonds, contain two groups. Those that with substantial self-employment, think about your dentist, your podiatrist, some physicians. And those have larger gender earnings gaps than the others. Many of them are technicians that do not have any self-employment. Therefore, another clue to why there is persistent gender gap in earnings concerns the large differences by earnings by sex across occupations. But the question is, what accounts for that? When mean hours worked by individuals are included in this regression for annual earnings of full-time workers, the largest elasticities of earnings with regard to hours are for business occupations, and the smallest are for those in science, tech, and in health without self-employment. Therefore, earnings rise more with hours worked in business occupations than in the others. But why? I have termed occupations for which the implicit hourly wage increases with hours or with intensity of hours to be greedy occupations. These greedy occupations have particular work characteristics as given by the BLS ONET dataset. These characteristics are, for example, greater demand for FaceTime, greater demand for client contact. They are occupations for which work is highly interdependent and less able to be done alone, which is why that pilot's weird. These characteristics increase along the horizontal axis toward the right and decrease toward the left. Along the vertical axis is the residual ratio of female to male earnings, or this gender gap in earnings. So what you can see is that the red squares have the largest wage gaps, the highest level of the ONET characteristics that define these greedy jobs. And the green and the yellow triangles have the smallest gaps, the lowest levels of these ONET characteristics. We can now put the clues together and understand why the gender gap in earnings widens over the life cycle of women, why it is larger for women with children, why it has been so difficult to close. It isn't simply an issue of family responsibilities. It is also caused by the fact that the labor market offers choices that entice couples with family responsibilities, that entice them to forego couple equity. And for different sex couples, this means ditching gender equality along with couple equity. The greedier are some of the jobs, the more likely will a couple with care responsibilities opt to have one member of the couple take the greedy job and the other take the more flexible job. In most different sex couples, this means that the woman takes the more flexible job, which is lower paying, and the man the greedier job, which is higher paying. So let me put this in a little diagram. Consider the following depiction of this relationship between earnings and hours for two jobs. One job, so the horizontal axis here is hours, the vertical axis is total earnings. One job is flexible. It's the red line. It has a linear wage with regard to hours. It doesn't matter how many hours you work, you just get paid the same amount per hour. But the other is a not so flexible blue line. It has a wage, which is the slope here, that rises with hours. A couple with children, for example, or with other care responsibilities, can't both work at the blue dot. If they did, the children would perish. But they could both work at the red dot. But if they did, they would be leaving a lot on the table. And that's that difference that I've marked. So therefore, one works at the flexible, less remunerative red job, and one works at the less flexible but more remunerative blue job. For many highly educated couples with children, she's a professional who's also on call at home, and he's a professional who's on call at the office. In consequence, he earns more than she does. And this gives rise to a gender gap in earnings, but it also produces couple inequity. If the flexible job could be made more productive, the difference would be less and family equity would be less costly. Couples could purchase it. It would be cheaper to purchase and also reduce the gender gap. The point is that the gender gap in pay is not simply an issue of workplace discrimination, although that's to be discussed as well. And it's not simply one of biased supervisors. Workplace biases and disparities exist. But even if the labor market were unbiased in all manners, a gender gap in pay would still exist and would still be substantial. One part of a solution is to lower the cost of flexibility. And the simplest way is to create effective substitutes between workers. And that has been done in various occupations that use IT to substitute, to enable this substitution, to effectively pass information and hand off clients. Teams of substitutes could be created, as they have been in various fields such as pediatrics, anesthesiology, veterinary medicine, personal banking, and many tech jobs, pharmacy, and primary care medicine. One silver lining to the dark times that we lived through in the pandemic is that we learned to use technology to work from home. And we also used technology to do handshakes and conferences remotely separated by miles and oceans. WFH, as long as it does not become work from hell, has made the flexible job more productive. Remote business interactions have made the greedy job more flexible. Work has benefited caregivers and especially women. So in conclusion, I have described an evolving economic force. In the period of the rising portion of the U, women came out from the shadows of the home. They came out to work in the market and make their families and themselves better off. They then went the distance as their employment elongated through their lifetimes to have more meaningful work and even to have real careers. Differences in productive characteristics between them and their male counterparts were greatly reduced. But the last mile, the last chapter, and the final act of the gender gap saga can't be written until couples share more and until the world of work makes that a less costly thing to do. When different sex couples give up couple equity, they increase gender inequality. When couples increase couple equity, they advance gender equality. So I am proud to have been depicted by the Nobel Committee as, and depicted here, described by the Nobel Committee and depicted by the graphic artist whose work I have been showing. I've been depicted as a historical detective. But my detective work could never have been done without foundational ideas from many people, from Jacob Mincer, from Gary Becker, from Esther Boserup, and from the late Richard Easterlin, who died just a few weeks ago. And I also thank my co-authors and my dog, who unfortunately died a few weeks ago, too. Yeah, it's okay. And I thank you. Okay.
Anybody have any questions? You also have a microphone in front, too. Here you go.
Sure.
I'm just curious. Do you know if anyone has done this research as far as a two-person income family with children, looking at same-sex couples? Is the delineation of housework the same?
This is work that many people would like to do, and the problem is that we don't have enormous amounts of data, right? Since this questions about same-sex couples, particularly from the census, are not that we don't have a tremendous amount of information, but it does seem pretty clear that that sharing is better, and that incomes are closer, even though incomes are probably somewhat lower for men than they are for same-sex couple men than they are for men who are in different sex couples. But yes, there is a growing literature on that. Yeah. Yes.
So, how does the story that you told look different if you're looking at non-college educated workers? Do the patterns remain the same? Or?
The patterns, some of the patterns remain the same. The differences are somewhat, as I showed, the differences in earnings are somewhat less, right? But some of the patterns are the same. One of the problems is that it's much harder to have categories for it. So once you get below, so the cutoff that I had was 60,000 a year. Once you get below that, it's very hard to categorize occupations in the way that I did. Yeah. But there's no question that one has some of the same issues going on, right? Yeah.
Given the current political climate, how are you feeling now? Are you optimistic going
I
forward?
don't. One of the wonderful things about being an economic historian is that the past. Am I optimistic? I think I would say probably like everyone in this room, I'm scared. This is a coup. Okay, this is wacko. Okay. I'm scared not just for us. I'm scared for Palestinians in Gaza. I am scared for people in Ukraine. I'm scared for people all over the world. I am scared the same way that Europeans are scared now. Yeah.
Hi there, Professor Goldin. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you can speak about, in your research, what the most sort of successful interventions, policy, or from the government or from unions have been in terms of reducing the gender pay gap, and in what fields those efforts have been most successful.
I don't think I can. So I would say that there are lots of policies that have been highly successful in enabling us to be the people we would like to be. So, for example, changing state laws that hindered our ability to get birth control. Changing those had enormous effects. That is not the type of policy that most people think about, and yet I would say it's it's perhaps one of the most important. Okay.
My question is, I know this is on career and family, and you talk about women from 25 to 54. Do you have any information or data given women working longer
Oh,
and
yeah.
women
In
beyond
fact, I have a
54
book called
given
Women
I'm 56?
Working Longer. Right. So, absolutely. I don't stop. Take it from me. I'm not stopping at 54. Okay.
I want hope. I'm 56, so
Okay. No. You're a kid. No. So I edited a volume and wrote several chapters in a book called Women Working Longer. Yeah.
So my question is now in your study, it was just couples and the inequality and inequity between that, or was there a study done of single women in the workforce?
This is
and
everybody.
the gender pay. So that
I
is
got
everybody.
everybody.
Okay, I was just wondering if that was
Yeah.
specifically that. Okay.
No. The issue was what happens in general to women versus, since we're generally looking at women versus men, we have to look at women versus something. Okay? So we look at women versus men. So, in fact, a large fraction of individuals with care responsibilities are single moms. Okay? So they're in here too. I once took a New York Times journalist to task for the fact that during the pandemic, there were articles, of course, about how much additional work there was for parents, okay? And he wrote this as if every child was living with a father and a mother, okay? And I wrote to him and I said, the implication is that 23% of our children were conceived without a sperm. It's not true.
Okay. Recently, we had the 20th anniversary of an event that Charles Rosenberg calls 114, where Larry Summers talked about women and underrepresentation in many high positions. And some of us were at that meeting at the time. And I know you had to weigh in at that controversy about Larry Summers' speech. And he got into a lot of trouble because he talked about intrinsic aptitude at the highest end, and a lot of people talked about that. But one of the things that I think he irritated a lot of women in the audience, they were academic women, and he talked about how women are less inclined to take jobs of 80 hours per week. And these were a lot of academic women who were working 80 hours a week, as often happens at the tough jobs in academia. And I was wondering if you could have any later reflections on that time. And maybe Larry sounds like he's evolved a little bit on these issues, but I wanted to hear your reflections on that whole controversy at the time.
Did you say you were in the room?
I was, yes.
So you know I was in the room.
Yeah, I can tell. Yeah, I can tell you some of the people who were in the room at the time. Yes, so you.
There were very, very few people in that room.
Yeah, it was about 30 people.
About
actually.
30 people.
Yes.
Yeah. Larry certainly learned a lesson, which is that when you're president of Harvard, just because you say to a group, this is just among friends, it's not. And there were people in the room who were clearly not his friends, okay? I don't think we want to go into all the details of that, but let me say that if you read the volume that came out of that session, not where Larry spoke, Larry introduced a session, there was a paper which was an academic paper that said not much different from what he said, okay? It's the way Larry said it. But it was also other things that Larry said that turned people off in that room. It didn't turn me off, it turned lots of other people off. Yeah. I'm not going to defend Larry, but I would say that what he said in that room was not as extreme as it has been made out to be. Okay. Yeah. How Larry was Secretary of the Treasury for all that time and didn't get into any trouble, and then comes to Harvard and gets in trouble constantly, day after day, means that he had people controlling him, monitoring him at Treasury that he didn't bring with him. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for being here with us and for your work. It's incredible. But I'm curious if what you gathered regarding the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 and kind of what the impact of that was on the gender, both pay and wealth gap, I suppose, and what your thoughts are about the fact that it's been overturned and what that may look like.
Sort of hard to unpack this because, as you know, 1973 was that was a surprise to the women's movement. Nobody expected the Supreme Court to come down with that decision in January of 1973. The women's movement was on a roll at that point. The ERA passed Congress overwhelmingly just a few months before, and then suddenly in 1973, Roe v. Wade. But what we should all realize, of course, is that abortion was legal in many different states before that. So this wasn't as cataclysmic a change as it might be if you say, suddenly, in 1973, abortion is legal. It was legal in many places, but it wasn't. Just as today, we have a decision that says we're taking that back, but we're sending it back to the states, right? So, what was the rest of the question? What happens now?
Yeah.
That means what happens tomorrow, which means what happens in the future. And I'm an economic historian. I think that one of the most important things that I am thinking about in a book that I'm writing now called Why Women Won, and if you think that women didn't win, let's think about what life was like in 1963, okay? Women have won a tremendous amount. But I think that what we have to think of now, collectively, is how to win as a nation and what it is that we have to do to win everyone in this nation so that we don't separate, so that we win and they win. Isn't that what collective bargaining is all about? Okay.
Hi. Yeah, this is fascinating. I'm really fascinated by the concept of greedy work. I mean, as a union person, I work with hourly workers who, for all intents and purposes, gender is irrelevant. You're paid based on your years of experience, and you come in on a grade, and on a grid, on a pay scale that doesn't take into account. There's no preference by a manager how much you get paid. On the other hand, especially with all the labor shortages that there have been in healthcare, work is incredibly greedy. And in order to keep your job sometimes, or to be well thought of, you have to pick up after extra shifts all the time. And so work has been incredibly greedy in terms of extra hours. And obviously that is connected to gender and is connected to your role at home and how your family chooses to use the time resource. So I think I don't have a question because I have only gotten this
you've
far.
actually answered the question over there, which was, what about the rest of the distribution? The rest of the distribution is more hourly than salary. And the greedy issues are there as well because of the fact that working additional hours may be something that a woman can't do. Working Friday night may be something she can't do. Working Saturday may be something she can't do. And therefore, even when we look at earnings for hourly workers, for unionized workers, even when we look at, as people have done, the earnings of MBTA workers who are on a scale, men earn significantly more than women because they take the bad shift. They work hours when a woman wouldn't want to, or at night when a woman wouldn't want to, right? So it certainly means that because women, and this is no longer women aren't doing it because they're afraid to walk home at night. Okay, they're not doing it because the kids have to be fed and put to bed. Right.
That makes sense. And it seems like the role of unions to make sure that part-time work is benefited and respected and that people have flexibility and can choose that is such an important thing, because in the
Right.
private sector, they don't get benefits for part-time work in the same kind of way. And yeah, so again, no question, just fascinating.
No,
to think.
but you've raised a very, very important part, which is a very, very large part of the labor force, and the fact that care responsibilities impact what workers can do. So it isn't just what goes on in the family and what goes on in the labor market, it's the combination of the two. Yeah.
I really appreciate your presentation, particularly acknowledging the challenges and the distinctions, as well as the similarities of African American women. Just wanted to take it to the next level in terms of the fact that we're on the eve almost of the Commission on the Status of Women next month. I think it's the 69th. And while I think there's always this intersection between what's happening in our communities, both locally, nationally, and globally, and you very clearly pointed that out in your graphs, what would be a few points, 1, 2, or 3, that you would leave as recommendations that we can take back in terms of building for the common good, your concept of inequality and equity being a partnership in trying to address from the common good perspective of not only everyone in this room, but throughout the world, because we are seeing the grave impact this has on everyone. So what are your thoughts about that? And maybe you could mention a little bit of research you've done, or just in general, what we should be doing next to address your concept of this very important issue.
Yeah. The other thing is I never tell people what to do. Okay, thank you. So what I had said about how to make the world of work, in some sense, a kinder place for women, is that if there are more, so this is getting to the issue of how can we get the greedy out, okay? So Getting the greedy out is really very easy. If you have just one perfect substitute, then if you have to take your dad to the dentist, if you have to run home for any reason, if you have to come in late, you have a substitute. And the substitute is brought in, and you're the substitute for that person. So having more substitutes makes work more flexible. Having more redundancy in the workplace can pay for firms. There are some very, very good examples from the world, the most difficult world of nursing homes, where having even small amounts of redundancy means that a worker who comes in late doesn't get docked for her entire day. She can still come in late one day, 2 days, not every day. So there are lots of ways in which the world of work can be made kinder and gentler for those with care responsibilities. And some of the ways that I've been thinking of are really quite simple. And there are some good examples. Take sort of an important profession, pediatrics. So pediatricians take care of your children. They also, believe it or not, love their children and want to spend time with their children. So pediatricians, more than any other professional medical specialty, have formed groups. And that's because they know that a substitute means that they don't have to come in at 2 a.m. for a patient if there's a doc on call who's part of their group, who that child has seen. And so if you look at which specialties work as groups, pediatricians more than others, more than dermatologists, for example. So I think it's thinking in those terms about, yeah, right. Teamwork, where teams are teams of substitutes, not teams of complements. If you have to have a meeting on Thursday where every person comes in, that's death to flexibility. Yeah.
So Claudia, I have a follow on to that. So it seems like it seems there's sort of 3 different things, policies or culture change that we need. So you were just talking about making work less greedy. There's also a stream of changing our culture so that men feel as responsible for caregiving as women do, so that there's more equity in either providing that care or choosing who has the greedy job. But it seems the third piece too, I think, but your thoughts, is also our systems of care in this country at least are so weak and unreliable, both for children, hits home the elder care. So the fact that this issue follows women, I mean, to the earlier point about older women, follows you throughout your career, because once your kids are grown, you then have the responsibility for taking care of your aging parents.
Right.
I wonder if you see on that third piece, do you see any difference in OECD countries that have addressed that piece where the care systems
There's no question there's a difference. And I think that this gets to some of the biggest issues in America today, which is deep, fundamental divides. And so what we want is a world in which we have this giant, what we call overlapping generations model, right? Which is the model that we began sometime in the 19th century in the before that, in the 18th century, in which you pay local taxes and you send my kids to school, but then I pay local taxes and I send someone else's kids to school. And that's, paying it forward. And that's what we should want. And that's what exists in the countries in the OECD that do it right. But we don't have it. And we don't have it because of some insistence that somehow it's the responsibility of individuals to do it. And whether that's due to underlying racism, that the overlapping generation system is for one group and there was another group, or whether this just goes back to the same reason why we love our guns, because we think personal freedom is so important that we don't want the federal government in anything. Of course, as everybody here probably knows, the federal government today is responsible for less than 9% of K through 12 expenditure, okay? And so what we have seen is an expansion of pre-K, of preschool by localities, but we're not seeing it much by states, but very little other than Head Start, and that's not universal, right? So I think that that's the real issue.
Thank you. So there's been more discussion as of late, I would say, about this emotional labor, and a lot of the emotional labor takes place at home. But I would say emotional labor also takes place in the work site. So let's say you have a circumstance where you've got a man and a woman who's got the same job title, making the same amount of money, but there's still a difference in the amount of work that one perhaps takes on and in this emotional labor scope. Is that anywhere in any of this or what you're looking at into the future of how that element of
Yeah. So there are people who work on that. I don't. Many of the people who work on that are across the river, okay, in that other part of Harvard, okay, which uses our name and seems to run itself more like a for-profit institution. Yeah, no, there is some good work done on that. Yeah, as to who does what and who gets credit for what.
Thank you, Professor Goldin. I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Zoya. I'm the researcher at Harvard Law School, and thank you so much for your fantastic study presentation here. So from the studies, looks like the flexibilities is one of the factors to close the flexibilities is one of the factors to closing the gender pay gap. And from now, we know that digitalizations, it is helping to become more flexible for the work, such as work from home, and we meet through the Zoom. But for the high-paid industry, such as technology and finance, the gender pay gap still exists, despite the high-level digitalization. So I would love to learn some knowledges about you and what do you think about this phenomenon? Yeah, like I would love to know more about the back mechanism related to this. Like the high pay industry, it is already have those digitalizations, like we can meet at home and we can do those things.
So I think you're asking the question, certain industries have increased their flexibility. The question is, will this show up in increasing women's earnings relative to men's? That's the question. Okay. That's for us to study. So the interesting thing is that without a lot of data and a lot of time, you simply don't know. So journalists, for example, are constantly asking me, did what happened yesterday affect something today? We call that blips on blips, okay? I don't know. I can't tell you. So your question is a very good question, and it's the beauty of, I often tell my students, the fact that we don't know the answers to things, the fact that we have change, means that you have a job. You know, the unfortunate thing is that my husband Larry and I wake up every morning and we think, oh gosh, Trump has just given us another natural experiment. You know? Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to know, I know that you did a lot of information based on, different regions, but in the United States, was there, if you broken it down a little bit, was there a state that maybe the income gap was?
Yeah, there's often a problem with that you need to really hold lots of things constant, because you're always going to find, for example, that if you're a woman, just go to DC and your income will be very much higher. There are people who study this also with respect to the fact that certain places, namely often the South and parts of the Midwest, are places in which women either are held back or hold themselves back, okay? So there's a lot of work on social norms and how they differ by region, and also misogynistic views and how they differ by region. And once again, we're going to have a lot of interesting new work on that. That's an excellent point. Yeah. We often treat the U.S. as if it's one country, but it's not. Yeah, the food is getting hungry.
So I imagine that it's difficult to measure and study the burden of unpaid labor or domestic labor. But if there is an accurate way to gather that information, have you seen with women's presence in the paid workforce being more prominent, have you seen there be a decrease in unpaid domestic labor for women, or do you hypothesize that they're just taking on more of the load on both sectors?
Well, the constraint that everyone has 24 hours in a day must then mean that we have sort of marketized some, but we haven't marketized at all, right? And it's the stuff that we haven't marketized that is shifted more towards women in the home, okay? But the total, I mean, just look at the American Time Youth Survey numbers. The total has gone way down, way down over the period, let's say, from the 1950s, for sure. Okay, yeah. There is progress. Okay, microwaves.